promise you a 1,000-year voyage guided by compassion.
How's it going, everyone? My name is Iron Stark, and today I'll be showing a build centered around the Euporia, one of the new Twinblades introduced in the Shadow of Erdtree DLC, and well, the best holy weapon in the game, and it's not even remotely close. The Euporia shares the same moveset as most Twinblades in the game. However, what separates Euporia from other Twinblades, and frankly all weapons in Elden Ring, is its mechanic referred to in the item description as Luster. How Luster works is after landing a certain amount of successive hits, Euporia will gain a golden glow, where the weapon buffs itself with more holy damage. With recent buffs in the 1.13 patch, 3 light attacks, or 2 heavy attacks, will trigger the first level of Luster. Landing 3 more light attacks, or 2 more heavy attacks, will trigger the second level of Luster. So what this creates is a weapon that natively buffs itself when landing successive hits, and promotes a very aggressive playstyle, and that's only half of the unique mechanics of Euporia, which we will get into more detail when exploring its weapon skill. As for the scaling of the Euporia, it's pretty squarely a pure faith weapon, with a B scaling in faith, with a scaling value of 90, although it is worthwhile to spec into either strength or dexterity as well, once you reach the last soft cap of faith at 80. Because the scaling value of strength and dexterity on the Euporia is 45, which isn't too bad for a D scaling. The unique skill of Euporia is the Euporia Vortex, a move where the player spins the weapon very rapidly, in a way similar to a spinning weapon. This move is not very powerful in its base form. However, if Euporia Vortex is used when the Euporia is buffed with Luster, it will unleash a powerful blast of holy damage, similar to Comet Azur, or the Sword of Night and Flame's weapon skill. This attack is easily one of the most devastating holy damage attacks in the game, capable of doing over 10,000 damage in one go. Also, unlike Comet Azur, the player can still move while in the animation for Euporia Vortex. However, using the blast will remove the Luster buff from Euporia, so the weapon skill combined with Euporia's Luster mechanic, creates an interesting dynamic. You can maintain aggression in order to keep level 2 Luster with a very powerful holy damage buff consistently throughout a boss fight, or, once you have a big enough opening, you can use Euporia Vortex and very likely end the boss fight right then and there, because genuinely, with the right talismans and holy damage buffs, most things you fight will be obliterated in its wake. For offensive incantations, this build does use a few holy incantations. While they are not the centerpiece of this build, they do act as nice ranged options and synergize well with the talismans and Physick that this build runs, and are powerful enough on their own. Multilaytered Ring of Light is a holy projectile similar to Discus of Light, where the projectile spins in place several times and deals very solid damage, and can be chain cast to melt enemies. Golden Arcs is a holy projectile that fires 3 arcs at an opponent and does decent damage, but the real upside to this incantation is that it deals 15 stance damage if all 3 arcs hit. Considering that it can be chain cast, this can ramp up stance damage very quickly. The last offensive incantation this build uses is the Black Blade incantation, a holy projectile that deals incredibly high damage because it applies the Destined Death effect on its targets, sapping health over time and shaving off 10% of their HP, which is represented by a gray bar on a boss's health. What's worth mentioning is that the grayed out health doesn't return, contrary to the gray bar going away eventually, So Black Blade essentially deletes 10% of a target's HP while applying damage over time for 2 seconds. The primary stats for this build are Faith at 80 for weapon and incant scaling, Strength at 17 and Dexterity at 26, 31 with Millicent's prosthesis for additional weapon scaling, Mind at 20 for weapon skill use and casting, and Endurance at 30 for aggression, because this build is centered around aggression by triggering the Successive Hit buffs and the Luster mechanic. The armor for this build is to fit the gold and black aesthetics of Euporia, because again, fashion is king. Although my setup does meet the 51 poise breakpoint, this build is wearing the Oathseeker's helm, Divine Bird warrior armor, and Malekith's gauntlets and greaves. For talismans, this build utilizes those that enhance successive hits and holy damage. Sacred Scorpion Charm increases all sources of holy damage by 12%, but decreases physical damage negation by 10%. The Two-Handed Sword Talisman increases the power of all light and heavy attacks by 15%, so long as you are two-handing. Rotten Wing Sword Insignia and Millicent's prosthesis both act as successive hit buffs, whereas the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia gives a slightly stronger successive hit buff, whereas Millicent's prosthesis also provides +5 to dexterity. A potential talisman you can run with this build is the Axe Talisman, which increases the power of charged heavy attacks by 10%. I would recommend running this talisman when going against bosses that have high holy damage resistance, as the Axe Talisman affects all damage types, not just holy damage like the Sacred Scorpion Charm. For buffs, there are 2 routes you can go with when using this build. The primary setup I use is stacking Golden Vow, which increases all damage by 15% and all damage negation by 10%, with the Sword of Light's weapon skill Light. Light is a body buff, which increases the power of holy damage by 20% for a minute. I use this buff setup for most of the showcase because there are no drawbacks to using Light. It is essentially a free 20% damage buff to things like Euporia Vortex and this build's Incantations. The second buff setup this build uses is stacking Golden Vow with Howl of Shabriri, a body buff, which provides a buff of 25% to all damage types for 40 seconds, but increases the amount of damage taken by 30%. Howl of Shabriri does give a much stronger buff as a whole, because it affects both holy damage and physical damage, but the cost is generally riskier than just using Light, because Howl creates a situation where you will take 40% more damage between Sacred Scorpion Charm and Howl of Shabriri if you get hit. So I only used this buff setup when I felt I absolutely needed the extra damage, because frankly, Golden Vow and Light combined was already powerful enough on its own. For Physick tiers, this build uses only one main setup, the Holy Shrouding Cracked tier, to increase the power of holy damage by 20% for 3 minutes, and the Thorny Cracked tier, to provide an additional successive hit buff. When going against bosses with high holy damage negation, I substitute the Holy Shrine Cracked tier with the Spiked Cracked tier to increase the power of charged heavy attacks by 15% for 3 minutes. So I did mention 2 different offensive buff routes, so I wanted to demonstrate the difference in power between the 2. To begin, this is the power of Euporia when two-handing with the Sacred Scorpion Charm. This is the power of Euporia when two-handing with the Sacred Scorpion Charm, Holy Shrine Cracked tier, Golden Vow, and the Light buff. This is the power of Euporia when two-handing with the Sacred Scorpion Charm, Holy Shrine Cracked tier, Golden Vow, and Howl of Shabriri. All footage for this video was captured during the 1.13 patch after Euporia was buffed, and in NG+. As always, enjoy the showcase.
Thou art of passing skill. Warrior blood must truly run in thy veins. Tarnished. I shall remember thee, tarnished.
true lord.
strength befits a crown.